Buenas tardes, nos encontramos este día en el Instituto de Fisiología Celular de la UNAM, en el taller de aspectos éticos y legales de la investigación con células troncales y neurociencia. Para ello nos encontramos
buenos días.
Doctora Chang, Sara Chang y Guadalupe Vieira. Doctora Chang, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here in Proyecto Grado, Cero. Doctora Chang, what is important of the use of stem cells in scientific research?
Thanks very much for inviting me to this interview. I think that's an excellent question. Stem cells are one of the areas of scientific research that is currently creating the most interest around the world and in this country. One of the reasons for this is not only their potential to contribute to the development of basic scientific knowledge, but also the potential that stem cells hold for developments in regenerative medicine and cell-based therapies. Because stem cells have the capacity for renewal and the capacity to differentiate into different types of tissues, it's thought that they may be of great use in conditions where the repair of tissue is needed. For example, in neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, in the treatment of chronic disease, for example diabetes, and in the treatment of injuries, spinal cord injury, for example, in cardiovascular disease and so forth. It's very important that the research is supported all the way through from basic research with the various types of stem cells, including not just adult stem cells but also embryonic stem cells, pluripotent stem cells, all the way from the laboratory through the process of clinical development to the clinic. This is the only way, I think, in which we're going to obtain useful results from this research.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Which are the ethics issues in the development of stem cells and his research?
There are ethical issues that need to be kept in mind, both at the level of the basic research, the laboratory research, at the level of research into developing therapies, so clinical research, and also in the distribution, so at the stage when therapies are being made available in the clinic. To give a few examples, one of the areas of most controversy surrounding stem cell research is, of course, the use of human embryos. Now, some people argue that because embryos are human beings, they deserve protection and therefore we ought not to do research on them. Others will argue that because the embryo is not a developed organism, because it lacks the neural structures necessary to support not just consciousness but any form of sentience and feeling, that if there is sufficiently good cause, as in the case of stem cell research that could produce valuable knowledge and therapies, then we may have good cause to do these experiments. But embryonic stem cells are not the only type of stem cells that raise issues. For example, the use of what we call adult stem cells also raises the problem of how we treat tissue that is derived from research subjects. So if, for example, I decide to donate some of my tissue to a laboratory to do research, what rights do I still have over those cells? If they take the cells and develop them into a stem cell line that can be of great use in research and therapy, ought I to have the right, because they are my cells, to say what can be done with them, or should they be public property to be used for the good of all? So these are some of the issues associated with basic research. You want me to go on?
Next question. As we know, in UK has a legislation to regulate the use of stem cells. How can Mexico get this kind of law? Because many of these problems are not regulated in the legislation, Mexican legislation. How can it get it, or maybe how can you explain that?
The regulation of stem cell research in the UK, just to explain, it's highly regulated, but it's also a permissive environment. So although we have quite extensive regulations governing the use of human tissue and the use of human embryos in research, nevertheless scientists in our country are permitted to carry out research with embryos and to derive stem cells. I think that the key is to think that regulation does not have to mean prohibition. And in fact, in a situation where there's less regulation, in fact, that can hold back research. So when scientists are uncertain of what's permitted, that may actually stop them from being able to do the work that they need to do. As I understand the situation in Mexico, at the moment you have laws that are somewhat unclear in terms of what may be done and what kinds of research may be done with embryos. And I would say that regardless of whether you end up making a law that is more restrictive on research or more permissive, what's important first of all is to attain some clarity in the law. Secondly, I think that where the regulatory system in the United Kingdom is particularly strong is that we recognise that research involving embryos and research involving human tissues is always going to be an area that creates some moral controversy. There is always perhaps going to be some disagreement about the moral status of the embryo. Our law does not take a firm position on the protection of the embryo at all stages, but the strength of the law is that it incorporates what we call principle-based regulation. We have in the UK a licensing authority that makes decisions about what types of research will be allowed with embryos. This enables the authority to take into account the various ethical issues and to make decisions on a case-by-case basis, as well as to respond to public opinion and scientific need in a more flexible, more dynamic and more rapid way than it would take to have a separate piece of legislation for each example. So I think these are some of the strengths of the system we have, and I think it's quite a good model for other countries to adopt if you are looking to develop a system of regulating research.
That's a very good opinion for make better our legislation. And in your opinion, what are the challenges and the benefits of stem cells treatments and neurotherapies?
I think one of the big challenges that we face with the development of stem cell therapies at the moment is that we are in a position where a lot is possible, but a lot is also not yet fully proven. And I think that we need to be quite careful about how we make treatments available. So we know that at the moment there are many clinics around the world that are offering stem cell treatments and stem cell therapies in various stages of development. It is probably the case that some of these treatments being offered are not necessarily proven, they may not have real tangible benefits, there may not be sufficient scientific evidence, and some of these treatments may even cause harm to patients. This clearly would be a very bad thing, not just because it harms the patients who are subjected to these treatments, but also because these type of, we might call them, I suppose, fraudulent treatments can damage the public's trust in science. It can hold back the field of research as a whole because we're unable to distinguish whether a piece of therapeutic research is genuine or whether it is not scientifically founded. So I think that's one of our big issues at the moment.
Okay, and at least, why is it necessary to create a number of policy approaches to regulate the treatments and to make available this? Why?
I think, as I've said, to help us to get stem cell therapies online more quickly, what we want is, as our end goal, is a treatment that works, a treatment that is safe, a treatment that is fairly available to those who need it. I think given the issues associated with the development of stem cell therapies, there are 3 points that I think should be emphasised in policy. The first is that no matter how experimental treatments are carried out, we want to make sure that we are increasing scientific knowledge. So when a treatment is given, are we following up the results? Are we trying to understand whether that's worked or not? Are we monitoring it for safety? So no matter what route we take, I think it's important to try and make sure that every step we take is a step along the way towards that proven treatment. I think we also need to be concerned with our regulatory mechanisms. We know that certain forms forms of regulation can push the development of therapies down one path or another. I think what we need to make sure is that clinical researchers, patients, doctors and scientists are encouraged to take the route of developing experimental treatment that leads us most quickly to our goal of effective and safe treatments. And finally, and I think this is an important point within this country, we know that having different standards of regulation between countries can also cause problems, both in terms of different standards required for safety and efficacy, in terms of different standards for licensing, and so forth. And I think one thing we should be quite aware of is the way in which the transnational regulatory environment can affect the development of treatments. I think we should look at ways to try and harmonise regulation more so that we don't have regulatory gaps in the global context.
Thanks a lot for this interview. It was wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here. Agradecemos a la doctora Chan. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias and best of luck with your project.
Agradecemos al Instituto de Fisiología Celular de la UNAM, al doctor Ricardo Tapia, al doctor Rubén Lisker, a la doctora María de Jesús, a la doctora Sara Chang y al Instituto para la Ciencia y la Ética y la Innovación de la Universidad de Manchester. Muchísimas gracias y sigan en contacto con Proyecto Grado Cero. Hasta luego.